Okay, we should be live. Welcome everyone to another edition of the Supernatural Side Salad Show. Uh, we have Ozzy with us. He was going to attempt to fill in some time, more than anything else, to get things started by answering a few questions that people had from the previous Magic Sandwich show. So I might just let Ozzy fire away with one of those points. And if, in the meantime, if anyone wants to join us and has any questions or topics they'd like to bring up, we're probably going to stick to what was on the Magic Sandwich show last week, including justification of atheism, reason for being an atheist, I suppose. Sorry there, I just had feedback from the actual broadcast. So, Ozzy, did you have one of those questions?
Yeah, sure. Just for the benefit of people who are watching or are going to be watching this later and who didn't watch Magic Sandwich Show last week, the first hour of the show was devoted to the question of whether or not atheists have a burden of justification or a burden of proof to defend their atheism. And of course, much of this conversation might depend on how one wants to understand or define atheism. And so I put forward a standard philosophical position that any claim that you make about reality, any position that you hold about reality, any belief that you have about reality, never mind what you're prepared to assert publicly, but any belief that you hold, any opinion you have about reality, is only rationally warranted, is only justified if you have some reasons why you think that it's true. Of course, if you have terrible reasons, then well, a sufficiently bad reason doesn't amount to a justification or a warrant for the belief. And the reason this is important is because in the dialogue between theists and atheists, those of us who are atheists or non-believers, non-theists or agnostics, we're sort of challenged constantly to explain why we're atheists, and that's fine as I see it. But it's most galling to be told you have to defend atheism when all you have done so far is ask, why do you believe in God? Because when you ask a person, why do you believe in God, if they do believe in God, they should be able to give you their reasons. And they shouldn't turn the table and then ask you, no, I don't have to justify why I believe in God. You need to justify why there's no God. They shouldn't presuppose that the question issues for them because you don't believe in a God. That's just turning the tables. I mean, one theist to another can ask that question, right? So there's when you ask a question, why do you believe in God, that is not necessarily motivated by a disbelief in a God or a lack of belief in God or agnosticism or anything of the sort. It could be even motivated by a shared belief in a God, right? One religious person to another can ask that question. And it's very galling to have the tables turned on us, okay? And as a result, what's happened is there's been a kind of defense mechanism has arisen where a lot of atheists want to balk at that and stop this table turning and insist, no, I don't have a burden of justification when I've asked you why you believe in a God. But this has turned into a kind of a weird sacred cow in the atheist movement, wherein people now think, a lot of atheists now think, that even when you assert that there's no God, or even if you believe that there's no God, you can still define your atheism as a mere lack of a belief, and hence there's no burden of justifying your position, because really it's not a position at all. You're merely not believing something, and not believing something isn't a claim about reality. Now, it's of course true if you don't make a claim about reality, that you don't have a burden of justification, but of course you can't play it both ways. You can't pretend that you don't have a position about God's existence when you do, and then go around saying you don't have a burden of justification. And unfortunately in our movement, a lot of atheists go around saying God is unreal, gods are illusions, no God exists, gods are all fictions, gods are all myths, gods are all delusions, gods are all human inventions and artifacts of the human imagination, and so forth. And all of those claims are claims about reality. Those are all claims that amount to reality. Reality doesn't include any gods. And if that is your position, if that is what you actually believe in your heart of hearts, well, it doesn't matter how you define atheism. You can define atheism as a lack of belief or the positive belief that no God exists. It doesn't matter. The point is, the burden of justification that you bear doesn't rest on how you define atheism. It rests on what your position is. And so if you are of the position, if you are of the belief or the opinion that gods are non-existent, for whatever reason, that you need to give what those reasons are. If you're just asking another person why they believe, then of course you don't have to give your justification. But if you are asked and you tell them what your position is, then you need to bear the burden. But what you shouldn't do is refrain from giving your position out of some fear that you're going to have to give a justification, right? If you don't want to, tip your hand and say what your position is, that's your prerogative. You can say, well, I don't want to say what my position is because I'm asking you what yours is, and my position is irrelevant to how you defend yours. But that works both ways. And so if a theist asks you, why do you think there's no God, and that's your position, you can't turn the table on them and say, no, you have to justify. No. How the theist justifies his belief has no bearing on how you justify the belief that you have that no God exists. And so there's an unfortunate hypocrisy here where a lot of atheists are defining their actual position as a lack of a position. And this, I think, is unconvincing, unpersuasive, and it's a bit of an embarrassment. And it's something that we should get out of the habit of doing. And there were, unfortunately, a lot of critical comments under that last episode. A lot of people raising objections to that. And so what I thought I would do is address some of those. But before I address some of those, I'm curious if anybody in the Hangout here has any questions for me about that.
I think that maybe where it got injected into the, I suppose, more popularized atheist movement, I suppose, is because a lot of people who were religious, Christian fundamentalists, were, sort of proposing, we have the answers over here. We know, we have all knowledge in God. We know what's going on. So, you try and justify your position, and the burden of justification they were trying to get is unfair. It's because they're claiming that they have this, all-altering knowledge that's just, they're not justifying themselves. So I think that sort of maybe pushing back at that, people got a hold of and were like, yeah, hey, you know what, you can't say that God's all-knowing, etc. You got to prove you're God. And so it's sort of a lazy way to sort of dump the argument. It's sort of like, no, you got to prove you're God. No, you got to prove that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's definitely table turning. That's absolutely right about why people have sort of embraced this idea of atheism merely being a lack of a belief. Part of the motivation was simply trying to get theists to own up to the burden of justifying their claims, and to remind atheists, hey, when you ask a person why you think that, why do you believe in a God, it's never okay for them to say, no, I don't have to answer that until you've answered why you think there's no God, or you simultaneously have to answer why there's no God while I'm answering why there is a God. It doesn't work that way. If I ask you a question, you can ask me a question in return, but it doesn't matter. I can say, well, I'm not interested in answering that question. I'm just here to ask you about your position if I want, okay? And although that's not particularly polite to ask a person what their position is and then not volunteer your own when you're asked, but nevertheless, it is important that people understand that whenever you make a claim about reality, whichever side you might happen to fall on an issue, and there can be more than one side of an issue, it's a condition of public assertability and rationality that you be able to justify your position. And simply playing your cards close to your chest or sort of withholding what your view is isn't a solution to the problem, because the problem is really, is your position, whatever it is, warranted? Is it rationally justified or not? And the idea that your position is just justified by default is really silly. No position is rational by default. People will sometimes say, well, listen, I was born, and when I was born, I didn't come with a belief in a God, right? And if nothing ever persuaded me or convinced me, then I'm rationally warranted in continuing to not believe. That's actually incorrect. What you've done there is you've explained why you've never acquired a belief in God. but you have not justified the position that there is no God. So if that's your position, that there is no God, all your work is still left ahead of you. You still have to justify why you think there's no God. Pointing out or explaining why you didn't acquire a belief that most other people have acquired is not a justification for your position, whatever your position is. I mean, consider just an analogy for a moment. Imagine, we're all born, and when we're born, none of us are born believing in the Holocaust. Okay. Now, if you grew up not believing in the Holocaust, as all of us do, we grow up not believing in the Holocaust until at some point someone tells us about the Holocaust, right? So you could potentially go a long way through life if you sort of if you're sufficiently isolated from civilization. You can go through much of your life or all of your life, never having heard of the
Any form of
Holocaust.
television or books.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there will be cultures in the world even now where they've never heard of the Holocaust, right?
Oh,
You can be such a
absolutely.
person,
Yeah,
right?
I was being
So,
silly.
I'd like to cut in, if I may, because
yeah.
we
Could I maybe just finish the point, George?
Sure.
So, if you go through life and you've never heard a reason to believe in the Holocaust, perhaps you've never even heard of it, but let's say you've heard of it, but you've never heard a reason to believe it, that explains why you don't believe it. But if you were to then go on to say the Holocaust never happened, right? There's no such thing as the Holocaust. And someone were to say, well, why do you say that there's no Holocaust? And you say, I've never been presented with a convincing reason to believe that there was a Holocaust. You've got a problem, right? Because any Holocaust denier will say exactly that, right? So a Holocaust denier is not the same thing as a person who's never heard of the Holocaust. And a person who has heard of the Holocaust but doesn't believe in the Holocaust because they've never heard a good reason has an explanation for why they don't believe it. But what they don't have is a justification for thinking that it didn't happen. And it's the same thing with God. So what's important here is that there's no such thing as a position that is true by default or that is rational by default. Right? There are positions that we start off holding no position on all kinds of issues, but it isn't therefore rational to hold a certain so-called default position. That's not what makes a position rational. The idea that you can have a rational position that has no rationale, that has no warrant, that has no justification, is practically a contradiction in terms. Okay, thank you for letting me finish, George.
Sure. I just wanted to point out that we have. I missed the first few minutes, so I'm not 100% sure we are talking about the validation of having to prove God exists. That was the point, I think.
Do atheists? Does anyone who thinks that a God doesn't exist have a justification, a burden of evidence, or a burden of rational justification for that position?
Yeah, because I've talked to you about this, I think, twice before, and twice you've refuted my idea. And the last time, I believe, was last week, even in the. I'm not sure, but and you've refuted my idea, but perhaps I think it is because I was not clear on my idea, and basically I'm not willing to explain my position whether there is a God, but I look at it from another perspective, is that I do not look at physical evidence, I look at the historical evidence, and basically the evolutionary anthropological reason how man evolved became to have a belief in the natural world, invented religion, then invented the gods, etc., etc. For me, it is a question of order. I say you have basically the Big Bang, and then you had the dinosaurs and all that, and then man evolved, man invented fire, started eating meat, their brains grew larger, started wondering about the world around them, came up with odd ideas about the natural world, and then thought there was perhaps a person behind doing it all, and then came up with gods, and that's for me personally, my idea, which is supported by evidence in basically partly in history and in what you call science when you dig people out, dig stuff out of the ground. I can't come.
Archaeology and
Yes,
archaeology.
archaeology. Those kind of evidence all show basically towards the evolution of religion within human society. And that for me is the validation why gods do not exist, because that is what the evolution of religion shows us. And I know there is still a lot missing, but that is my reason why I say I that I do not have to uh, prove why God does not exist, but I am doing that by presenting that evidence, which is far from complete yet.
Okay. Yeah.
But last time when we talked about it, you still said yes, but you still have to give your evidence. But that is my evidence.
Yeah. No. Here's why. The proposition that's put before you is do you think God exists? And if you think not, why not? Now, what you're saying is, well, I have an alternative explanation for why you theists out there believe that a God exists. It's part of human nature. There's a historical story to be told here. There's a story of the history of ideas. And if you look at human civilizations across time, across the globe, what you see is a pattern of people making crap up, right? Myth making, right?
Yes.
And so we know that people will just do this. There doesn't need to be a God for people to invent one, for people to believe one, right? So what we have here is an alternative explanation for why people believe in a God. But that's not a reason for thinking that any specific God doesn't exist. Right?
Well, I do not see the difference, because that specific God is the same as all the other gods. That's basically the argument. Atheists go one God further.
Okay, well, let me put it this way: people invent all kinds of horrible imagined atrocities and crimes. I mean, just look at the Bible; it's full of atrocities and massacres and stuff like that are invented. Imagine if someone were to say, if you look at the history of human civilization, if you look at the history, if you look at archaeology, if you look at anthropology, if you look at human literature, what you will see is a story of people inventing all kinds of atrocities, all kinds of massacres and conquests, and which didn't happen. Right? History and literature is just replete with these things. Therefore, I don't believe the Holocaust happened. Right? Because the Holocaust is another such story, one person could say. Right? That wouldn't be a reason to doubt that the Holocaust happened. It's a reason to think, well, wait a minute, the Holocaust is a pretty extraordinary event. If that happened, or if Stalin's massacre of millions in the Soviet Union, if that actually happened, I'm going to have to hear a reason to believe that. But what you can't do is say that no God exists or no massacre exists just because you can point to the fact that people are in the habit of just making crap up. The fact that people make crap up, cut from whole cloth sometimes, is not a reason to point to any particular instance and say, in this particular instance, this story is false. Right? That's a non sequitur.
But that's basically indeed what I say. People make crap up. It's a long process, but let's shorten it to they make crap up. But the only way I can prove that people make crap up is by presenting that evidence. That's all I can do.
But no one would challenge that. Every theist in the world would be happy to tell you that all the other religions are false, right?
Yes, of course.
Right. So they're granting you that. So you haven't made. What they're saying though is that my story is true. What reason do you have for thinking that my particular religion is false? And they're granting you that the pattern exists. They're saying, why do you think the pattern applies in my case?
Because suppose I'm talking to a Muslim about this, and I say the evolution of religion, etc., etc. The Muslim religion only started in the year 800 or 900 or something like that. But my evidence goes before that. And when I talk to a Christian, who will say, well, Jesus lived around the year 0, etc., etc. I say yes, but my evidence goes before that. And when I talk to a Jew whose religion existed since 300 before 3000 before Christ, I will say yes, but my evidence goes beyond that. And suppose
how is that relevant though? That I mean, so what
because
if religion
it's like
prior
specific.
because it is the order, the flow of things that came into existence. A Muslim saying that in the year 800 or 900 Muhammad came up with Allah and this religion, that's a starting point. But my evidence goes before that.
May I say, George, just in the example of what would you say is your reason for not believing in a God that exists outside of the universe, that started the Big Bang and then everything's happened the way that we scientifically know of it now? Because that's sort of more, I guess, of a way to look at it, because then you can't, unfortunately, sort of say, in the example of Jesus, like you say, and in the example of like specific gods, you can say, hey, your book's only 2,000 years old, man. We've got evidence from millions of years ago. But I think sort of what Ozzy's sort of more getting at is like, just merely the proposition.
Yeah, I know, but that's the point. The Muslim in the year 800, 900 would say there is a God beyond the universe, outside of time, etc., etc. But that particular bit of evidence you can see is false when you look through the evolution of religion.
No, that's precisely what you can't do, George. You can't show that it's false by looking at the fact that religions have existed before and there's been a history and an evolutionary history to religion. That doesn't prove that any particular religion is false. That's precisely what doesn't follow. It's a reason to be suspicious of any particular religious claim. It's not a reason to think that it's false.
You have to know a little bit about the evolution of religion. So I will need time to explain this. First, I'll try to make it.
We could even suppose that religion didn't, like, suppose, George, for a minute, that religion didn't exist at all. Like, let's pretend that it hasn't existed.
That's basically my point. I take a void position, a blank position on no knowledge. So there is no God, or there is a God. It's not a problem. It's a void position. And then humans started to develop. Started to observe the world, start asking themselves questions. They started to wonder about the world. They thought there must be something doing it. Then they thought there must be someone doing it. But you see, with the first religions that existed, that they had numerous gods. You see that in all the basic religions, the old religions, the more specified religions later of the Greeks and the Romans, they all have multiple gods. A god that explained love, a god that lived in the mountains, a god that was responsible for the weather, a god that was responsible for the sea. But there is how do you say that? There was monopolism. The word
monotheism.
That's monotheism. But what is the problem with monotheism? When you have gods for specific aspects of nature.
I'm sorry. No, you were talking about polytheism. I thought you were about to talk about monotheism.
Polytheism. Yes, polytheism.
Yeah.
So multiple gods. So what's the problem with polytheism is that all those gods, you see that from the stories, all those gods interacted with each other. You even made love with humans. But it basically means that all these gods had specific powers, but none of these gods had ultimate power. Those are the old religions, and because all those gods had all specific powers, it basically means that there already is something beyond all these gods that's more because you have the god of the sea, but the god of the sea can't command things, can't command volcanoes, for instance. So those gods have specific powers. And around those times, you see that having multiple gods was a downside. When a society was conquered by another society which had other gods, you see that the religion changes. Why? Because it is very difficult for those old cultures to take either your gods away or to deny those other gods from the people that conquered you. And you see new religions emerging from that, because the culture that got conquered had a volcano god, and the culture that conquered them also had a volcano god. So those two stories got mixed up, and you have a new.
George, hang, let me interrupt you for a moment here.
Yes.
Nothing you have described here about the evolution of religions is new to me.
No, but of course I'm not ready, because I'm about to explain the God that is beyond the universe. That was the question.
But the point is, what you're doing here is called the genetic fallacy. Pointing to how an idea originated never implies that the idea is false. Never. That is, you can never conclude that an idea is false on the basis of how the idea originated. Everything you could be saying is true, and I actually think it is true. But it does not follow from the fact that a particular religion looks like it's the outgrowth of some earlier religion is a reason for thinking that that religion has to be false. You can't reject it on that basis. You have to actually look at the claims.
But I'm not rejecting it. I'm basically saying, when you see the evolution of the religions, it explains how religions and the gods evolved. And
but every theist will grant you that. Every theist will say, yes, I know that humans invent religions, and that there's a historical and evolutionary story to be told about the history of ideas and the history of gods, and how. Right? I mean, they'll grant you that.
But the point is, when you look at how the universe was created, none of these gods explained that. And at that point, there was still no God that said there is an ultimate God that has all the power and knows everything.
But so what? I mean, remember, consider a religion like Christianity or Islam. These are revealed religions. What these religions posit is that God basically, stood by for a chunk of history and didn't do much, and then at some point he intervenes in history, right? Mm-hmm. Pointing to the fact that there were religions before this religion came along doesn't undermine or contradict anything in that religion.
But still, that is the evidence.
Evidence of what? It's not evidence that the God doesn't exist. It's a reason. What you're providing is another reason for is a reason that explains why a person might believe it if the religions are false. If all religions are false, how are we to explain that all these religions are false? How could they arise? And you could say, well, it's just a function of human nature and human imagination, right? But that's assuming that the religions are false. That's begging the question, right? You're assuming, on the assumption that all these religions are just bullshit, how do we explain why all this bullshit comes about? Oh, well, look at this history of
yes. But that is the evidence, and when the theists say, well, present me the evidence, well, that is the evidence. You have to look at the evolutionary anthropological reasons why a human does what it does, and that is the evidence.
No, but that's like saying I can prove the Holocaust didn't happen to someone who believes in the Holocaust by pointing to the prodigious history of people making up fantastical, phony historical claims. You could never disprove a particular historical claim by pointing to this enormous history of made-up histories. Right? That would just be a non sequitur. The person would look at you like, what, you're making a mistake. This is the genetic fallacy. You're saying, listen, I can explain such and such, how such and such a thing might have arisen, therefore your claim is false. It simply doesn't follow. That is a non sequitur. What you're doing is you're giving an inductive reason for why it makes sense to doubt any particular. Right? If it turns out that, look, all these religions make incompatible claims, they can't all be true, and when we look at the history of ideas, we have reasons to think that people are going to make up religions, and we can explain on that basis why people would make up a religion even if it wasn't true. Then we can look at any particular one and say, well, maybe this is one of those too. But then yours is false. You can't
Yeah,
say
but
that that
but
particular.
then you're saying atheists do not exist, and all people that claim to be atheists are agnostic, and I disagree.
What? What? Who? I don't understand how that
Because
follows.
basically, because are basically telling me there's no way ever for me to prove there is no God, even when
Well,
I just presented the method
no,
on
no, that's
how it
not.
was invented.
No, that's not at all my view. My view is some gods can be disproven, some gods cannot be disproven. But I don't have to disprove something to have a reason to think that it didn't happen, right?
Which God can't I disprove?
Which god
Of
can't
course.
you disprove? Well, I
Yes.
think, well, consider like the god of classical deism, for instance, the watchmaker, clockmaker god who invents all of reality, set in motion all of the particles in the universe from the Big Bang onwards, in some predetermined act of creative will, and
Yes,
then walks away. And this is a non-interventionist god. You're not going to be able to
but
disprove.
but that is the God of monotheism.
No, it's not monotheism. That's a god of deism. It's not a monotheism.
I have to look up the specifics. What you mean then?
Okay, but in any case, it doesn't matter. Let's say that it is. Let's say that it was a species of monotheism. What you're doing is you're saying, look, this God is a part of is yet another God in the long history of gods. But so what? So what? The Holocaust is yet another story in the long history of stories, some of which are true and some of which are false. How do you know if this one is a true or false one? By looking at the specific claims made about the Holocaust, not by pointing to the long history of historical falsehoods that have been invented. Right? This is literally the genetic fallacy. You're saying I can offer up a reason for how this came about. Therefore, I can write this off as false. That's a genetic fallacy. It's a fallacy. It's called a fallacy of origin, the genetic fallacy. Not explaining how an idea came about never
Yes.
implies that the idea has to be false. It might be false,
But
but
basically, I'm not basically telling about the idea, the things in our heads in the end, but it's still under development, under construction, basically, and that's because evolutionary anthropology is basically very new science because it has a few other sciences within it,
mhm.
but that is the end goal, basically, of I think will be the end goal of evolutionary anthropology to prove that. But because it also involves how the brain works and psychological tests and all that stuff. So
Yeah, but I mean, they're not going to be able to prove that a God doesn't exist. What they will have is an alternative account for why the religion exists. They're not going to have a way of establishing that the religion doesn't exist, right? The religion could be true, and everything that you've described could be true. They could both be true,
yeah,
right?
I get your points. I really do. I still disagree. So
Well, that's
it's
okay.
basically a different mindset we have. I
Yeah,
think so.
yeah.
We are both on the same side anyway. So
Okay. Um,
I think, yeah, I think, well, in any case, I think if you spoke to more people who had more of a deistic position, I guess, George, I mean, you get more of an idea because it's just no use telling them, that, hey, Christianity was made up by some people and it's changed over the years and that's why you shouldn't believe in God. Well, that's why you might not want to be a Christian or why you might consider, you know,
yeah, I'll try reading up a bit more about deism and perhaps my perspective changes. So we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think it will change because I mean, deism can be seen as just another story, another product, another version of a god, a more rarefied god later in the story in the history of ideas. Although an argument can be made that deism actually goes back a very, very long way to antiquity, but sort of the classical deism that we think about, people like Thomas Paine and such, that's fairly newfangled, uh, but I don't see how pointing to the fact that an idea arose late in the picture explains it away as false. I mean, science. There's a story to be told about how science arose, right? Science is a sort of a late arrival. There's a story to be told about how science came to take hold. We wouldn't say, well, the science is just bunk because we have an explanation for how there's an evolutionary history, an intellectual history that informs how science came to be, right? You can't write it off that way as false and unreliable and useless, and and similarly with any historical claim or any religious claim, you have to address the actual claims. You can't say it's part of a pattern of falsehoods, therefore this particular claim is false. That's precisely what you can't do. You can say, well, hey, this gives me pause. You better have some reasons for why you think this particular claim is true. But what you can't do is dismiss and write off a particular claim as having to be false simply because it forms part of a pattern that includes a bunch of other falsehoods.
We have been joined by a few extra people. So did anyone else who's joined us have anything to ask Ozzy or postulate or purport, or that's not even a word, I don't think?
Well, I have a question to Ozzy regarding his views on the matter. What I gather for what you said is that you have a problem with atheists assuming a position of not knowing whether God or not exists. So taking a position which doesn't really need to be justified, although I don't know how you would say that, but then saying I don't believe in God, and then from that position saying Jesus is made up and making all sorts of claims, and when challenged upon that, falling back on the position I don't believe, therefore I don't need to justify that. That's your problem with how it's going now, right?
Well, the concern I have is that I don't believe something is not the same thing as I think such and such a thing is false. I don't believe X, and I think X is false are different propositions. And the difficulty that we have is that the atheist movement is full of people who, in their more honest moments and their unguarded moments, will say, I don't believe, I believe X is false. I believe theism is false. I believe deism is false. I believe I believe every religion is false. They'll go around saying things like this. And then when you ask them, why do you think that? They'll say, oh, no, I merely lack a belief in X.
That's because they just got a soundbite from Hitchens, man. He does say that, I swear.
Yeah, no, he does. There's a mistake that Hitchens make. It's a very commonly made mistake. It is literally running away from your position. You start off your position by saying, I believe X is false, and the person asks you, why do you think X is false? Oh, I didn't say I believe X is false. What I mean is, I merely lack a belief in X. Imagine if a theist said this, I believe God exists. Why do you believe God exists? Oh, I didn't say that I believe God exists. What I'm really saying is, I lack a belief in the non-existence of God. That wouldn't fool anybody.
No.
Right? And it shouldn't fool anybody. That's laughable. And a theist can characterize his theism as a lack of belief too, a lack of belief in the non-existence of a God. Does that mean that the theist no longer has a burden of justification? No, it's preposterous. The theist actually believes there's a God, and most atheists believe that there's a God. Now, there's some people who are really, they don't know. They're uncertain. They will neither affirm nor deny that a God exists, right? They're literally on the fence, right? We call these either fence-sitter agnostics or Huxleyan agnostics. And there are various forms of agnosticism. People who just, I don't know. I can't commit one way or the other. It has nothing to do with I can't know in the sense of I can't be certain. It's that I really can't make up my mind, right? There are people who really cannot make up their mind whether or not a God exists. In the same way that if you ask me how many hydrogen atoms there are in the universe at any given moment, is it even or odd? I don't know if the answer is that the number of hydrogen atoms right now is even or odd. I don't know. I can't make up my mind. I have nothing on which to go on, and whatever evidence you could put forward I think would be weak and inconclusive. And there are a lot of people who take this kind of view about God's existence. Those people are non-theists, that's true. But they're also non-atheists, right? And the only way you can subsume them under the heading of atheism is if you just declare that every non-theist is an atheist. When traditionally it's been the other way around. We've always understood that atheists are non-theists, that atheists are to be subsumed under a larger umbrella of non-theism. And the word non-theism has been around for 150 years or more now, just like the word agnosticism has been around for a long time. And there's no reason to go around redefining atheism as we've commonly understood it. And a lot of people actually, in comments under the Magic Sandwich Show video last week, were insisting that I'm getting the definition of atheism wrong, that I'm sticking to some narrow definition. And just let me read out some definitions here.
I saw some people putting out, just before you do, but I think the atheist experience sort of explanation, at least that I had gathered and had understood, at least until a few other conversations that I listened to and reading up a bit more, but that atheism, that the whole point about agnosticism being about knowledge and atheism being about your belief in a God, and that virtually you can be, well, essentially, I don't know, it was sort of asserting that all, I think that's where the whole proposition of all atheists being agnostics came about, because it's like
all agnostics are atheists. Yeah, the claim is that all agnostics are atheists because they lack a belief in a God.
Ah, yes, yes. I think people try and do it in the reverse as well, in the same way, but in any case.
Well, my concern here is that people in this discourse really are out of touch with how the word atheism has been used in modern languages. I'm just going to read a few definitions here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, this is a secular encyclopedia of philosophy, a contemporary, analytic, fully secular encyclopedia of philosophy. Here's the definition. Atheism means the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God. Right? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary, again, not a theological work, right? Atheism is A, disbelief, not a lack of belief, a disbelief in the existence of a deity, or B, the doctrine that there is no deity. The compact Oxford English Dictionary says that atheism is the belief that God does not exist. The Cambridge Advanced Learners Dictionary says that an atheist is someone who believes that God or gods do not exist. Webster's Concise Electronic Dictionary is an atheist, one who denies the existence of God. Right? Now consider the word non-theist or non-theistic in the Oxford Dictionary. Not having or involving a belief in God or gods, right? Doesn't that sound like lack theism? Doesn't that sound like lacking a belief? Right? That's what non-theistic means. That's what non-theism is, right? A lack of a belief, that would be in God, that would be non-theism. That would be lack theism. Okay, but it's not atheism. Atheism has traditionally been defined this way. Now we're not locked into these definitions, right? Words change their meaning. There can be a semantic shift. The culture can change, okay, and we can adopt a new definition of atheism. We could, all of us, just say, well, we're going to go with lack theism. We're going to say that from now on, atheism is to be defined as merely a lack of a belief in God, and so it's going to include atheists, it's going to include agnostics, it's going to include theological non-cognitivists or atheists. That's great. So now the word atheism now means what we used to call non-theist. Okay, we can do that. That doesn't change a thing with respect to the burden of justification, because if you're the kind of lack theist, if you're the kind of non-theist, if you're the kind of atheist under this new definition of atheism, who goes around saying gods don't exist, you're still making a claim about reality. And the fact that you've subsumed yourself under a larger umbrella of lack theism doesn't get you anywhere. It's what you think is true. It's what your belief is. It's what your opinion is on the matter, not what heading you belong under. Right? It's not what label you slap onto yourself that imposes a burden of justification. It's what you think is true, to whatever degree you think it's true. But what happens is people hear the expression burden of proof and they wet their pants, because most people know, I can't prove that a God doesn't exist, or I can't prove that all gods don't exist. And they think, oh, well, if I can't prove conclusively, like a geometric certainty, that all gods don't exist, oh no, I won't be able to do it, and so they run away. But that's not what burden of proof means. Burden of proof is just the English translation of the Latin expression onus probandum, and all that means is the burden of justifying your position. All an atheist needs to be rationally warranted is to be able to provide reasons for thinking that a God doesn't exist. right? And most atheists actually do go about explaining why they think gods don't exist. They explain,
Like I did.
like George did. They go around explaining why they think there's a better explanation for why people make up these religions. They go around explaining that there's a lack of evidence, specifically a lack of evidence where we should expect to find it. They point to inconsistencies between what we see in the world and what we would expect to see if a God existed, based on the theology and the religious books that people uphold as evidence. They point to logical, internal inconsistencies in the very concept of the God that's put before them, right? Every time an atheist is doing that, they are in fact discharging their burden. So why are we running away from the concept of burden of justification when most of us are actually doing it? Most of us, though, are not doing it very well, and one of the reasons that we don't do it so well is we're not in the habit of doing it, and we're not in the habit of doing it because we're told you don't have a responsibility to justify your position. And we're leaving it to the other side to discharge their burden under the assumption that only they have a burden and we don't. That's not how it works. Okay? If I think that the number of gumballs in the gumball machine is even and you think it's odd, then you have your burden and I have mine. And if you are truly agnostic and you say, well, I don't know if it's even or odd, I'm unconvinced, that's fine too. Then you don't have that same burden of justification. But unfortunately, most atheists in the atheist movement have stated their position. They state it all the time. You can listen to Bionic Dance, you can listen to Aaron Ra, you can listen to people talk about what they think about gods and whether they exist, and it's pretty conclusive. They think that gods don't exist. And then in the next breath, they'll say, no, I'm not saying that gods don't exist. I merely lack a belief. I'm simply unconvinced, right? Well, yes, you might be unconvinced, but you're also going around making a claim about reality, namely that reality includes no gods. And that incurs a burden of justification. And most atheists actually do make half-hearted attempts to justify their position, but a lot of us in this online movement have sort of fallen in for this sacred cow that we don't have a burden of justification in order to remind the other side that they have a burden of justification. And we're abrogating our own epistemic responsibility, and it undermines our credibility as people who want to uphold the values of rationality and skepticism. You don't come off looking rational and skeptical when you say, my position is true by default, it's rational but it has no rationale. It's reasonable but there isn't a reason for it. It's warranted but I don't have to give you a warrant. Right? This sounds manifestly silly to everybody on the other side, and that's why they're not convinced. And that's why people insist that atheism actually has been traditionally understood in a more narrow sense, meaning the view that a God doesn't exist. And most atheists actually do think that gods don't exist. And I think we need to be more honest about this.
Well, okay. If I use your example of the gumballs or the hydrogen atoms, or it doesn't really matter what it's about. So suppose that if you think they're even, you're a theist, and if you think they're uneven, you're a Gnostic atheist. So a person that knows no God exists. Well, I think now at least some atheists, including myself, I consider myself to be a agnostic atheist, so someone who doesn't know I'm not sure that they're not gods, but I don't believe in God. So and if you ask me whether there are even or uneven number of gumballs, I say I don't know. I know there are arguments for even or uneven amount of gumballs, but these are my refutations for these arguments, and therefore I hold this position of not knowing whether they're even or uneven, and that's my position. Then.
Right, but notice that's agnosticism. That's pure. What you described as the purest form of agnosticism. Right?
Yeah.
Most atheists will say, but that's not really atheism, or they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to define that as atheism. Right? Well, it's okay. You can define it as atheism, but now we need to be clear that there are very different kinds of atheists. There are atheists, and then there are atheists.
Yeah,
there
well,
that's who think there's no God, and there are atheists who are completely on the fence.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's why I tend to use, and what I think is more useful, to combine the terms agnosticism and Gnosticism and theism and atheism into 4 categories of Gnostic theist, Gnostic atheist, agnostic theist, and agnostic atheist.
Yeah, I think that's fine for categorizing different kinds of atheism, but all you're doing now is characterizing different positions with respect to believing that there's no God. A Gnostic atheist is a person who says, "I know there's no God."
Yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of a silly position. I think that
Yeah. Well.
I think
Yeah.
that's too strong. Okay, you can do that for some gods. I mean, I'm a Gnostic atheist with respect to certain gods. With respect to Christianity, I'm a Gnostic atheist. With respect to Zeus, I'm a Gnostic atheist. I know those gods don't exist. Those are ridiculous. Okay, but but there are other gods about which I'm going to be agnostic. Okay, so what am I going to do? Am I going to go around saying I'm a Gnostic or agnostic atheist? Well, it depends which God I'm talking about. I can't go around saying I'm a Gnostic atheist or I'm an agnostic atheist, because my agnosticism and my Gnosticism with respect to my atheism is relative to the specific God in question. So you can't go around saying I'm a Gnostic atheist or an agnostic atheist unless you happen to be a Gnostic atheist.
Are you saying, though, that
about
you
every
lack...
God.
Are you saying, though, Ozzy, that you lack a belief in a God until you potentially were presented with a reason to believe in a God? In that way, are people getting confused and saying, I don't actually, I can't say that I know that no gods exist, but I certainly lack a belief in a God.
Well, if you don't believe, if you think that something doesn't exist, you lack a belief in the existence of that thing, right? So atheism implies lack theism, right? Right? But lack theism doesn't necessarily imply atheism. Okay. So what I'm saying is, I am a Gnostic, strong, positive atheist with respect to some gods, but other gods, right? I'm not in a position to make such a strong argument, right, to establish that they don't exist, right? So for certain other gods, okay, sort of vaguer conceptions of God, for instance, what I have to do there is be an agnostic, weak, or negative atheist. But what that means is that whether or not I'm a Gnostic or agnostic atheist depends on the God that we're talking about. I have no business going around calling myself a Gnostic atheist unless I'm a Gnostic atheist with respect to every God, or an agnostic atheist unless I'm an agnostic atheist to every God. So you can only say that you're a Gnostic or agnostic atheist with respect to a specific God that you're talking about.
I know,
it's not a global position.
I know, but if a theist comes up to me and says me that he's a Gnostic theist, he has the same problem.
Exactly.
He has a Gnostic theist for Christianity, but not for Islam or etc. etc. etc.
Exactly.
So
that's exactly right.
Are you positing that we need another or a different term or something for this problem, because we always keep it with how things are now?
I'm positing that this little chart, this 2x2 chart of Gnostic atheism, agnostic atheism, Gnostic theism, agnostic theism, that this is actually a bit of a waste of time. When people ask you, do you believe in God? The answer is not yes or no. The answer is what kind of God or which God are you talking about, right? And then I can answer it, okay? Because my answer might be different depending on the God you're talking about, right? So if you ask me, Ozzy, do you believe in God? And I go, no. If I say no, it's because I'm going to assume that I know what God they're talking about. But if I don't know which God they're talking about, okay, if a fundamentalist Christian says, do you believe in God? And I know he's talking about the God of Christianity and Christian fundamentalism, I can say no, right? But if I'm not sure who I'm talking to and they ask me that question, I'll say, well, which God are you talking about? Because there's some gods I'll say, no, I don't believe in those. And then there are some gods I'll say, I don't believe in them, but I don't believe in them because I happen to know that they're false. They're ridiculous. They're demonstrably false religions, right? There are some religions that I think are demonstrably false. And there are some religions that I think I don't believe in, but are not demonstrably false. But I have reasons, nevertheless, to think that they are false, but they're not. I don't know that they're false. So there are religions that and gods that I know don't exist, and then there are some that I don't know exist, but I have good reason to think, right? You don't have to know something is true or false to say I think it's true or false, right? You can say I'm more confident that such and such a God doesn't exist than not. That makes you an atheist with respect to that. You're kind of a weak atheist or a negative atheist, or you can call yourself an agnostic atheist if you want. But what you're doing there is you're saying you're an agnostic or a weak or a negative atheist with respect to a certain conception of a God. Not all gods, right? Very rare would be the person, the atheist, who goes around and says, I'm an agnostic atheist or agnostic atheist with respect to any and all gods. Right? Those people probably haven't thought through how many religions there are, right? So I think that breakdown isn't particularly helpful. I mean, I use that term occasionally as a kind of shorthand, but it really doesn't have anything to do with burden of justification. Calling yourself an agnostic atheist doesn't do anything to your burden of justification except make it a little lighter. But it doesn't allow you to escape having a burden of justification. If you think that it's probable that a God of a certain sort doesn't exist, you need a reason for thinking that it's probable that that God doesn't exist. Surely you have a reason, don't you? How else did you come up with this idea? Right? You can't say, oh, well, I was born thinking this. You weren't born thinking this. You were born having no opinion about God's existence. None. Zero. You were born without a concept of it. Right? So you were born lacking a belief in God, but you were also born lacking a belief in the non-existence of God. Does that make you a theist? No. It doesn't make you an atheist either.
Can I ask you something? Because from my position, I have no doubt within my heart, basically, that gods exist. So what is my position? Is it dishonest?
No.
No. It has nothing to do with... It's not. I'm not suggesting that a person's not allowed to believe what they believe. I'm not suggesting that there's a test that you have to pass to be an atheist. I'm not suggesting that you have to satisfy a burden of justification to qualify as an atheist. You're an atheist if you think that a God doesn't exist. You're an atheist with respect to that God. You're an atheist simpliciter if you think all gods don't exist for whatever reason. The question of burden of justification isn't what's required to be an atheist. It's what's required to be rational in your atheism. Yes. That's what's at issue, right? You don't have to have good reasons to be a theist, do you? You can be an atheist for the stupidest of reasons, right? We don't say, oh, you're not really a theist. You don't have good reasons. We say,
yeah,
no,
a good example for that is the movie with the guy that played Hercules. He was an atheist for a really stupid reason.
Yeah, there's all kinds of people out there who are theists and atheists for the dumbest of reasons. There are people who this is actually Shannon Rocky's in the room. We've had conversations about this.
Move the conversation around, Ozzy. Stop hogging the floor. No, I'm joking.
Well,
go ahead. I have hogged the floor.
Well, I thus far completely agree with you, but I guess I don't really see the problem with this. I think what you're getting at is because of this confusion with this how we have the definitions now leads to people being confused about their position and therefore not arguing as good as they could be.
Yeah, well, the concern I have is that people have been who have a position have been told that the name of their position is atheism. And they've been told that the definition of their position is lack theism, and that's not a position. So my concern is you have people who have a position who, if you didn't give them a bogus definition of atheism, of lack theism, would be inclined to discharge the burden of their justification. But because they've been told that their position is a non-position, they think that they don't have a burden of justification, and so they are running away from their burden of justification. They're running away from their epistemic responsibility, and I think that makes us look silly. I think that atheism has a very light burden of justification, and it's eminently defensible. So why are we not doing that? Why are we not defending this position? It can be defended, so we should defend it. But we are not doing ourselves any favors by characterizing our position as a non-position, as a default position, as merely a lack of belief, when in fact we do have a belief on this. Now there are people who really do merely lack a belief. Okay, there are people who have never heard of a God, for instance, right? They don't have to provide a justification for why they think there's no God when they've never even heard of the concept of God, right? It's not their position that there's no God, so they don't have to defend that position. You only have to defend, justify, and warrant the position that you hold. It doesn't matter what you label yourself as. The label is actually irrelevant. My concern with the label is that people are mislabeling themselves for the wrong reasons. They are labeling themselves atheists, and then they're defining atheist as a lack of a belief, and then the lack of belief is understood as not a position. If you have no position, then you have no justification. And next thing you know, you've gone from saying, I don't believe there is a God, I think reality includes no gods, and now but when push comes to shove and you're asked, why on earth do you think that? You say, I don't have to give you a reason. Oh, but it's rational anyway, by the way. This is practically a contradiction, right? This is my concern. I think we discredit ourselves in this movement by doing that, and especially since most atheists like to flatter themselves that rationality and skepticism is sort of in the kingdom of atheism, and we really look like we don't know what we're talking about when we do this.
There's a lot of atheist bashing going on in the comments, so I'm not liking any of this. No. I will say, though, that I always felt that, I mean, because I was brought up, brought up religious, brought up being told that God exists and not even understanding. It's so frustrating to not even understand the reasons for having a belief and worldviews and philosophy, and not even understanding any of those things, but first being told that yes, God exists, and coming from that side of things is sort of where more of where my atheism obviously comes from, because I lived my life for a number of years with believing that potentially that God was moving in the world, potentially that things were taking place, and that God was responsible for them, and that God was responsible for us being here. But when you sort of spend time saying, okay, I'm going to dump that original predisposition and suppose that, okay, let's just pretend for a while now that God doesn't exist, and going from that position and nothing changing around me, nothing changing in my experiences, nothing changing at all, I suppose is a big reason why I don't believe, well, I don't think that, at least many gods that, Christianity and Muslim and Judaism, these types of things propose, are reality, because everyone who's claiming from their position I can see them as just being me as what I was, thinking that that was the case, when in fact, now from my current understanding and study in that, it's just that, it's not the case. A lot of the things that I was told aren't the case. Age of the Earth, how long we've been on this planet for, the start of the universe, these types of things. Things that we can be sure about, at least. But yeah, did anyone else have anything else further they wanted to say? Or poke at Ozzy some more?
Well,
can you hear me?
yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh. So I was hoping that Ozzy and then maybe everybody else, since I think Ozzy should go first, could describe the characteristics of what makes a justification a good one and the characteristics of what makes a justification a bad one. And I'm going to mute because dogs.
Hello? Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing anybody, and my image is frozen. I don't know if people can hear me.
Well,
Can someone fill in? Can someone fill in?
Okay, sure.
Well, I know I was asked a question.
Ozzy's having technical difficulties. Trying to think of one time when hearing Ozzy speak about this, I suppose, justifications for believing something. Wow. Yeah, it all depends on what it is that you're claiming that thing is doing, I suppose, has a lot to do with it. I guess when people are making claims about gods that are healing people and making claims about gods that are speaking to them and making them come in touch with the dead and these types of things, they're making claims, stark claims about reality, which we can actually investigate and see if are the case. And so if you're going to believe those things, I'm not even sure you'd have to have some sort of evidential justification, one would think, for that prayer works or that you can communicate with the dead or these types of things. But as your definition of what your God is, I suppose, changes, or from where you're coming from, that justification also changes. And I think that also the lack of belief and disbelief in God, that sort of justification changes depending on what we're talking about as well. I'm not sure if Ozzy's back now. Are you?
Yeah. Things have unfrozen. Whatever happened there? I think I just lagged out. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right. So to answer Helena's question, you want to know sort of what the criteria are for warranting a belief. A belief is warranted when the reasons that you give imply the veracity of what you're claiming, right? And this is why saying, I've never heard a good reason for X is not a reason for thinking X is false, right? Because the fact that you've never heard of a good reason for thinking X is true explains why you don't believe X is true, but it doesn't justify the assertion that X is not true, right? And most atheists go around saying that X is not true, that God doesn't exist. So the fact that you have never heard a good reason might just be, well, how unfortunate for you that you haven't been exposed to the good reasons. But that doesn't mean that your position that God doesn't exist is justified, right? All you've done is explain why you have not come to this belief. But it doesn't explain why you've come to the belief that God doesn't exist, right? Really, it's quite simple. Your justification is simply a set of reasons or evidence which, if those reasons and evidence are true, imply the veracity of the proposition that you're putting forward. So if the proposition is that God exists, your reasons and evidence have to imply that God exists. And if you believe that no God exists, or a specific God doesn't exist, then you have to be able to put forward reasons for thinking that that specific God doesn't exist, or no God exists, if that's your position. And further, if your position is that gods are impossibilities, well, then now the burden of justification is even higher, because now it's not enough to give reasons why it's probable that a God doesn't exist. Now you have to, provide an argument that's so robust as to amount almost to a geometric proof that a God is an impossibility, and that's a much harder burden. So the burden of your justification is a function of the proposition that you're asserting, and the proposition that you're asserting is weighted, right? It's weighted with confidence, right? You can make the claim that gods are impossible, right? Well, that's a heavy burden. Or you can say, I think gods are improbable. Well, that's a lighter burden. Just as a theist can say, I know God exists, and it's an absolute certainty, and it's impossible for a God not to exist. Well, and now they need an absolute proof of God's existence. They can't give a probabilistic argument for why God likely exists, or why it's more probable that a God exists than not, right? So the burden of your justification is weighted based on the specific claim that you're making, and the reasons and evidence always have to imply the veracity of your conclusion. And now, Helena, are you also sort of curious, like what I think in the case of atheism is necessary to discharge that burden? Is that what you're asking? Because I can answer that too if you wish. She says sure in the side chat. Okay. Well, just to be clear, because my view is not that a simple lack of evidence is sufficient to discharge one's burden of evidence for provisionally rejecting the existence of the existence of something. Discharging your burden of justification as an atheist is a little bit more involved. There's a number of things you can do. First, you can point to the lack of evidence where one ought to expect to find evidence, right? You can't say Bigfoot doesn't exist because I've never heard of a reason why Bigfoot exists. That's a fallacy. But you can say, if Bigfoot exists, we should expect to find X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z is not found right where we would expect to find X, Y, and Z. Therefore, Bigfoot doesn't exist. Okay? So you can point to the lack of evidence where one ought to expect to find evidence. Okay? That's part of what it means to discharge the burden of evidence for provisionally rejecting the existence of something like Bigfoot or a god or anything. Right? And I say provisionally because, of course, evidence could turn up. Right? You don't have to be dogmatic about this. You can say, well, listen, presently, if Yahweh existed, I would expect to find certain things. I might expect to find an ark on Mount Ararat. I might expect to find evidence of an
Tower of
exodus
Babel.
out of, ruins of the Tower of Babel, a global evidence of a global flood, evidence of an exodus out of Egypt, and stuff like that. We should find this archaeological evidence, and we don't find this evidence. So this evidence that we should expect to find, we don't find. This evidence of the tombs being opened up and the Jewish saints rising out of their graves in Jerusalem when Jesus was on the cross and stuff like that. We should find evidence of this. Someone should have written a letter, saying, "Hey, you won't believe what happened in Jerusalem today. Forget about this Jesus guy. Listen to this. The dead were walking around. Remember, Uncle Shlomo? Well, he's back. This would have been news. Evidence. This is evidence we would expect to find if these stories were true, but we don't find this evidence. This evidence is conspicuously lacking. Okay, and that's evidence that the claims are false. Okay. Another thing you can point to is internal contradictions, right? Logical incoherence within the concept of a specific God or within a category of gods. Okay, that too is an excellent argument for provisionally rejecting the existence of these gods. Right. So if you can point out that various attributes of a god, like the omni attributes or something like that, they're mutually contradictory or something like that, then that's a reason for thinking that God doesn't exist, or that category, that class of gods doesn't exist. Or you could point out that there are contradictions between what the concept of that God implies and what we actually observe, those external contradictions, right? And this is really just a special case of, again, pointing to a lack of evidence where one ought to expect to find evidence. And in the absence of all of that, apart from all of that, okay, you can point to how something's being a mere, bare, logical possibility isn't a reason to affirm it to be provisionally true or even plausible. Because the number of such merely possible gods, logically possible things, the number of those is literally infinite. You can just keep making them up, right? And very many of these logical possibilities are going to be mutually incompatible, right? They can't all exist, right? If one person says, I imagine, a deistic creator and there's only one of him, and another person imagines a pantheistic God, and there's only one of it. And these are incompatible entities. Okay, they can't all be true. They're all logically possible, but they're mutually incompatible. So they can't all be true, right? Absent any evidential basis for identifying which of these barely logical possibilities are actually correct, we have no principled way to choose which of these bare logical possibilities to accept and which to reject. We can't accept all of them. If we tried to accept all of them, we'd bloat our ontology. We'd bloat our theory of everything that exists with literally an infinity of mutually incompatible and incoherent entities. So consequently, things that are merely logically possible, right, can't even be provisionally accepted because there's an infinity of such hypothetical entities for which we lack evidence. And because these bare possibilities are incompatible with each other, we can't accept them all. Having no basis other than evidence for accepting one over the other, we're rational in provisionally rejecting all of them, pending some convincing evidence or argument for affirming one of those possibilities over the others. So even in the case of very, very abstract gods, right, you can still give a reason why you reject provisionally all of them, okay, because you need some evidence to support any specific possibility. Right? And that, I think, is how you discharge the burden of justification for your atheism. Right? So some of those gods you're going to be able to prove right out of existence because they're logically incompatible. Some you're going to be able to point to the absence of evidence, and so you're going to have an empirical refutation. It's provisional, subject to revision, but nevertheless that still qualifies as a reason to disbelieve, to think that such a thing doesn't exist. Right? So I think it's quite possible to discharge the burden of justification, right? And we shouldn't run away. And if you think about what I've said, it's probably most of what I've said rings familiar. You probably never said it in those words to yourself, but you've probably done some of these kinds of things, made these kinds of arguments, heard these kinds of arguments. Atheists are routinely making these kinds of arguments, and so are in fact groping their way to discharging the burden of their justification for their atheism. Unfortunately, if you sort of, are drinking the Kool-Aid that tells you that you don't even have a position and that you don't have to discharge a burden, you're not going to be particularly good at it. You're not going to get in the habit of doing it. What you're going to end up cultivating is the habit of not justifying your position. And I think that's a very bad habit for someone who wants to think of him or herself as rational and skeptical to get into. One shouldn't get into that habit. Leave that to the people on the other side who don't want to justify their position. Leave that to them.
Is there anyone else that had anything to add who hasn't spoken yet?
Well, I maybe have a suggestion. Whenever Ozzy shows up on the Supernatural Sides of the show, I suggest we change the name to Ozzy's Sunday's Lecture, but you know.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
No, it's in a good way.
Okay.
I have nothing to add. It's completely...
No one's being forced at gunpoint.
No, look, basically, I take the position that I do not believe gods exist. I also do not believe in anything supernatural, and I get my justification by looking at the sciences, basically. And those sciences in this case would be, for me, historical evidence, anthropology, you name a few sciences, all those. So, and I'm not an expert in all of them because I'm not a scientist. I'm a layman, so just as most other people, but I'm very interested in the topic. So I read a lot about it and I talk a lot about it in Google Hangouts, of course, and in Google Plus forum. And I noticed the last few years I'm getting better at it, so I think that's a good thing.
And then there was silence. Yes, well, I mean, yeah. I didn't really know where to go from here. Was there anyone else that was jabbing you on the comments section there, Ozzy? Or?
Well, there were lots of other comments, but I sort of feel like I've eaten up an awful lot of airtime here, and there were other things that were discussed on the show, and maybe people would want to move on to that. Like another thing that we discussed was religion. Why is it still here? Why will we ever be rid of religion? And if not, why not? And if so, how will we do it? I'm wondering if maybe we should turn to that, or I can keep going on about this, whatever people would prefer.
Well, if anyone had a fresh opinion or an idea about that topic or anything, does anyone?
I don't particularly have anything to add to what I said on Magic Sandwich Show last week. Shanna was there, and she voiced an opinion. Maybe she has something to say.
About which topic?
Why religion persists, and is it always going to be with us, or will we ever be rid of it? And if not, why not?
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah. What?
Well, I think. Well, yeah. What do you think, Shanna?
No, I don't think it'll ever go away, ever. And I just think I think there's a lot involved in that. I mean, we have the human psychology plays a huge part. What kind of creatures that we are, that we're social creatures. I mean, it's endless, but it's not going to go away. Not in the sense in which people would like it to. And I don't think it's a very good idea that it does. I think it needs to be toned down a little bit. But if the only reason my neighbors isn't killing me is because they think God's going to punish them, I don't mind them thinking that. That sounds horrible. And there's obviously other things that we could do to get around that. But no, I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Well, preventative measures of violence, I wouldn't call that horrible in any means, but even if it did...
I'd rather people be, good, moral people without fear of punishment. That'd be fantastic. But they're not.
Yes. Unfortunately, there's not many. It doesn't seem to work. Get rid of prisons and we'll all live harmoniously and kumbaya and sing away.
Right.
Well, I mean, the way, if we're talking about religions as they are, I mean, the way they're set up as social, well, so they're so ingrained in a lot of cultures, and they're so ingrained, they're set up already because they have access to finance, obviously, that other institutions don't. Or they've had a head start over the years, in which case you could see it turning in a different way. I do hope, and I do hope that religion isn't replaced with sort of more of this Illuminati, batshit, pseudoscience-y kind of, but it's a belief, and sort of these, I mean, Scientology, I mean, I don't even understand why does it exist? I mean, how are people actually, I mean, it's out, like, it's not real, guys, like, what's happening? Am I missing something?
I think, I mean, I don't think that religion stems from, social control or any. I don't think that that's it. I think that that's a consequence or a byproduct, exploitation perhaps. But I mean, we're teleological thinkers. It's just what we do. We're hardwired for that. Whether you think it was intentional or not is irrelevant. We're wired for that. I mean, they do studies on children. I think I've talked about this before. I hate to repeat myself a million times. I feel so bad. But ask a child that's old enough to understand the question at least. Is a rock for anything? Oh yeah, a rock's for this, this, and this, and this, and this. Some of the answers are for birds to sit on. Everything has a purpose. It's just what we think, and that serves a function for us, right? I mean, we're able to figure things out. It helps us survive. It's good shit. But that extends out to other things, right? We see the crops raising in the field, and the sun's what's feeding that, and oh great, the crops are there, and their purpose is to feed us. The sun's purpose is to raise the crops to feed us. All hail the damn sun. Boom, religion. We just see purpose. We follow it as far as we can, and there you go. I mean, I think that it's, like I said before, I think that it's just human psychology, just the way that we are, the way that we perceive and process the world, and that's just where we end up. I'll try not to ramble.
That's more or less how I see it. That we're teleological beings. We're beings that look for reason, purpose, design, and significance in things, and that's just a function of our psychology, because we're incredibly social animals that have a neural architecture, that is always doing that, always looking for meaning, purpose, and significance in people's actions, and that hardware is humming along all the time. So that when you turn away from people and you look at inanimate objects, you're still disposed to look at inanimate objects or anything that has any kind of behavior in terms of teleology or purpose and function. We just can't turn it off. It's always there. So it's why your car won't start. You curse at it and you shake the steering wheel and you pound the dashboard and you kick the tires when you get out and you slam the door and you're mad at it. You're mad at this thing because you're treating it as if it's a person that's frustrating you, as if being angry at it is going to do something. I mean, when you think about it, it's positively mad that we slam doors when we're angry at because you bump your head on the cupboard door and you smash the cupboard door shut and stuff like that. We take out our anger at inanimate objects as if anger were appropriate. And it's perfectly inappropriate to be angry at an inanimate object, right? But we have animistic tendencies. We have a tendency to imbue inanimate objects with mind and purpose and intentions. We do it with our stuffed animals, obviously, but we also do it to ordinary inanimate objects. And so it's we look up in the clouds and we see faces, we see patterns, right? It's a function of how our brains work. So it's not surprising that when we look at the natural world that exhibits all kinds of order and complexity and regularities, that this apparatus is trained on that as well, and we come away thinking, oh, there's some kind of mind behind this, right? And so you might end up with an animistic religion or totemistic religion. You might end up with a monotheism or a polytheism, where the fields and the trees and are all seen to be inspirited or ensouled in some way. So I don't think it's surprising that we are sort of, sometimes we've been called homo religiosus. I'm not surprised that we're like this. And this serves as a kind of pseudo-explanation. So it also satisfies another need that we have, which is a need to understand, right? If you don't know why something in the natural world is the way it is, but you imagine that there's a mind behind it and purposes and intentions, then you can tell a teleological tale about why it is the way it is, and then that gives you some kind of grip on why things are the way they are. The contingency and the arbitrariness of the natural world is undermined by positing a mind and a telos and purpose and function in there, and so that's I think that's a byproduct of it. I don't think people just invent religions to explain. I think we are sort of naturally religious because of the way our brains work, and one of the side effects or consequences of that is that we get cheap explanations, placeholder explanations, pseudo explanations. But a pseudo explanation is something that people will typically settle for over no explanation, because complete uncertainty is really uncomfortable, especially when there's no answer forthcoming and it doesn't look like there's any possible way anyone's ever going to answer it. Right? Pseudo explanations will almost always strike people as more comfortable, unfortunately. And then on top of that, there's all the opportunities for cynical exploitation, where people can then press this into service to control people and stuff like that. But I don't think that religions exist to control people. I don't think they exist in order to bilk people out of their money. I don't think that they exist in order to answer questions. I think these are all byproducts of an innate disposition to look at the world in a certain way, teleologically. And for that reason, I don't think it's going anywhere. We just always have to fight this fight. We always have to sort of remind people of what our cognitive biases are, and that we have this tendency.
To always think you're right all the time. I did mean, though, just in terms of their presence, but I see what your point about their presence being explained more from people's innate sort of their minds trying to make out what they can of the world, their worldviews, that sort of thing. There was a point that Helen and George were talking about. It's actually, I'd like to bring it up because, I mean, I don't understand economics very well, but I mean, do we think, Aussie or anyone, that, like, does economics exist, like, in the sense, like abstract thing?
This is a question about abstract objects?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, abstract objects exist. Abstract objects exist as abstracta, right? I mean, there are different kinds of objects. There are physical objects to be met with in space, but there are other kinds of objects. There are mental objects, right? But a mental object isn't like, it's not like it's living in some other ontological realm. A mental object is just a notional object, right? But you can refer to it. It's real, right? Number 6, rather useful, right? The concept of addition, right? Very, very useful, right? Highly functional, right? We get a lot done with the concept of the number 6 and the concept of addition and equality and stuff like that, right? These are concepts, right? They're real. They have implications, right? You can't just stipulate and define any old damn thing about the number 6, right? The number 6, once you've defined it, has certain properties. It has certain deductive implications and consequences that follow from it, right? These are notional objects.
It's a lucky number. Did you know that?
No, I don't know. It hasn't been lucky for me.
The meaning of zero, the invention of zero. Basically, there was a revolution in mathematics and economics.
Right. Yeah. The concept of zero is really powerful. But I mean, but there are other kinds of see, what we're talking about here, there are different kinds of facts. There are ordinary empirical facts, right? Facts of things you can bump into in space, right? But there are other kinds of facts that we can talk about that are more abstract, right? Like the number 6 is there are facts about the number 6. What facts are there about number 6? Well, 6, for instance, is less than 7, and it's greater than 5, and it's divisible by 3, and it's divisible by 2, and there are facts about the number 6, right? And we didn't just stipulate those facts; we discovered some of those facts, right? We didn't define a triangle as something that has 3 sides, the angles of which sum up to 180 degrees, right? We discovered certain facts about that. Once we defined what a degree was, we discovered that the triangle has, certain angles that sum up to a certain number of degrees. Once we defined what those degrees were, right? We make discoveries in geometry. We make discoveries in logic. We just make discoveries in mathematics. A mathematician doesn't just invent new math and then say, hey, I've just defined a bunch of new things. These are the deductive consequences that I say that they happen to have, and now, who's on board? No, they don't take a vote on it. What happens is a mathematician actually discovers something in mathematics, and the other mathematicians go, yeah, you're right, you're on, this is true. They instantly see that it's correct or not. And sometimes there's some controversy because the proofs can be difficult or incomplete. But the point is, there are abstract objects, and we can discover facts about them, just like we can discover facts about the empirical world. It's not just a matter of pure invention. It's not like saying red means stop and green means go and yellow means step on it. You can still make it, right? Those things are just conventions, but there are things like logic and math and set theory and geometry. They're not mere conventions. They involve definitions, but they're not mere conventions. So there's all kinds of sort of facts in the world that are like that. And then there are, like, economics. Think about economics, right? Like, whether interest rates are rising or falling, whether the employment rate is rising or falling, there are facts about this. There are facts about whether the economy is improving or worsening, where interest rates have gone up or down, or whether employment has gone up or down. These are facts, but these are not objects that you can bump into space, right? So there are different kinds of facts, right? And we don't. But there's a tendency for some people to try to reduce facts to a certain kind of fact, and then they end up with problems. Then they end up not being able to account for it. They have to go around saying, there's no such thing as interest rates, right? There's no such thing as the rate of unemployment, right? There's no such thing as the number 6. But if there's no such thing as the number 6, then you can't say anything true or false about the number 6, right? And so we have to sort of be careful here. We have to make sure that our ontology can accommodate different kinds of facts, and that we don't reduce the word fact or the word real or the word existent to some narrow definition that corresponds to, physical objects like hammers and doors and earrings and whatever.
Do you know where 6 is located, though?
Don't even.
I have heard it's halfway to 12. So, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, but there's a problem with using exist for all those things, I think. Couldn't we come up with some other word for the things that exist but don't really exist, if you know what I mean, right? Like George was saying.
Yeah.
This doesn't really exist.
Well, no, I think it really, 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 really does exist. It's just that it has a different ontological character. Philosophers will say, well, it exists notionally, right? Or it exists as an abstract object. These are abstracta, right? So it's just that the word exists. The word exists is like the word sport. Okay, right? The word sport covers a lot of things, right? It includes everything from snowboarding and skydiving to lawn bowling, right? One could argue that I don't think that ballroom dancing belongs in the Olympics, right? It's more of an art than a sport. Okay, but what about synchronized swimming? Is that more of a sport or an art? Some people say, well, it's really hard. You would just, because something hard, does it just become a sport because you made it hard, right? No. So we have words that apply all over the place, and they have a family resemblance. I think of the word game. Okay. Think of board games, card games, role-playing games, sex games, war games, head games, and mind games. We use the word game for all of these things, right? Are these all the same kinds of games? Not a chance. Would it make sense to say, no. Role-playing games are going to be called one thing. Video games are going to have another name. Board games are going to be called something else. No, we just have different words. We put a qualifier in front of these words, games, to specify the kinds of games we're talking about. And with the word existence and the word real and the word object, we can do that. We can say there are notional objects and there are physical objects. There are things that exist as abstracta, and there are things that exist as physical objects. And so I think it's okay to have the word exists cover all of these things, provided that we're sophisticated enough to recognize that exists is a word like game, that it covers a lot of different kinds of things that bear a relevant similarity, but they're not all exactly the same kind of thing. And I think that's how we need to understand that. But what ends up happening is people, they want to constrain the word. They don't like that flexibility in the language. They think that's it introduces a little too much semantic slop. And so they want to say, well, I'm just going to narrow the word exists down to this. And then what they end up saying is that if exists or real refers only to physical things, then everything else, right, everything that isn't a physical thing doesn't exist, isn't real. So now it turns out that interest rates aren't real, right? That's kind of funny. It turns out that a relational property like being to the left of, right? To say that something is to the left of, okay? Well, where is being to the left of, right? Where is being taller than? Where is it? How much does it weigh, right? How much mass does being taller than have? Oh, well, you got to get rid of that. The property of being taller than doesn't exist. You got to get that out of your vocabulary. It's preposterous.
And love, compassion, reason, logic, gone.
Yeah. So we have to not narrow our vocabulary that way by saying that the only thing that exists are physical objects, because if you do that, then by implication everything else that isn't a physical object doesn't exist. Right? Well, if it doesn't exist.
So George, how do you answer that? How do you, as someone who seems like maybe you might describe yourself as a physicalist, how do you answer what Ozzy just said?
I was typing the triangle thing, so I kind of missed a little bit, but I can't say, and if I misrepresent what was asked, then tell me. But I think words and concepts are important. Suppose you look at the Inuits, the native Indians of the Arctic Circle, they have about 16 or 20 words to describe snow. And in the English language, we just have the word snow. So it is their concept of their reality is different. And you also see this in discussions, that it is always important to define what you are talking about, because one person thinks the word X means blah blah blah, and another person thinks the word X means something totally different, and then they go into a discussion and they're talking to each other but not about the same thing, and then you get trouble within the discussion itself. So it's always important to explain what you mean with a certain word, and that's also one of the troublesome things you see in science, that it is really difficult using the vocabulary you have to explain the world around you. Just look at Dr. Lauren Krauss trying to explain his theory about zero, and you get all those counter arguments by theists saying, well, zero, that's nothing, but he means something totally different with zero and nothing than the theists do. So you get friction and people not understanding each other. Does that answer the question a little bit?
Sort of, but I'm just curious about Ozzy's point about things that are abstract. It's fine to use the word exist in relation to them. You can say interest rates exist, love exists, compassion exists. But in our little side chat, you were saying, well, no, I wouldn't say they actually exist. And so I thought maybe you could discuss,
No, I said our minds try to explain the world around us, and words are just sounds, and we give them meaning within our brains. And some words really mean something, because a rock is a rock, for instance. And other words we need to further our understanding of our interaction with our environment. So I need a word when I pick up a rock and throw it. I need a word to explain the throwing. But throwing, yeah, it's a movement. Sure, there are abstract concepts within our brains because we need them to explain the world around us. Yes?
so you would say they exist, but in an abstract way, sort of
Yes.
as Ozzy was making the distinction.
Yes. Well,
I think you're just making the point about if a rose was named anything else would smell so sweet type thing, like labels. Just words are just words, like they're just labels.
This labels to describe something, like I have a name, but does it mean something in the real world? No. So my name is basically an abstract concept trying to describe me, but it does mean nothing. Besides that, it is pointing at me.
There's a confusion that goes on here, and actually, Helena in the side chat brought up sense versus denotation, or sense and reference, which is a concept introduced by a philosopher named Frege. And a lot of people fall into a trap that's called the reference theory of meaning. People think that a word only means something if it has a referent in the world, right? That this is the naive view that the way language works is by being names for things. Every word is the name of something. So I have a name, Ozzy, and there's this object that I'm looking at in front of me. It's called a laptop, and there's an object in the world to which the word laptop refers, and there's an object in the world, namely me, to which the word Ozzy refers. And so the idea is that the meaning of a word is its reference, right? The referent, the thing referred to, is what exhausts the meaning of a word. But language doesn't work that way. Of course, we name things. There are referents. We refer to things all the time. Okay, but there are all kinds of words that don't have a referent in the world, right? Think of the word. Yeah, go ahead.
Like I am throwing the rock. The word "the" means nothing.
Right,
But
it's
we
a
still
definite
need it to
article.
describe something.
Right, the word "the" doesn't have a meaning. It has a function, right? I mean, think of the word "this." Okay, supposing I point at my eyeglasses and I say "this," so I'm engaged in an act of ostension. I'm pointing to my glasses and I say, "Hey, look at this." Okay, what is the meaning of the word "this"? Well, in this particular context, when I commit this act of ostension by pointing at my glasses, in that context of utterance, the meaning of the word "this" is my eyeglasses. That's the referent. Okay. But the word "this" by itself doesn't have a referent. It only has a referent in a context of utterance, right? The word "this" by itself doesn't have any referent, right? Its meaning is exhausted by the context of utterance. Think of the word "I." Think of any indexical term like "I" or "me" or "you," right? The word "I" means what? It means whoever the heck is saying the word "I." That's who the referent of the word "I" is. I doesn't have a referent all on its own, right? It's not a proper name, okay? And a lot of the words in our language work that way. They work indexically, that is by pointing. Something is pointing to something. If I say to everyone who's listening in front of me, live and in person, and I say, "I'll be back in an hour." If I say that to you live right now, you look at the clock, you know when I'm going to be back. But if you walk into a classroom and on the blackboard it says, "I'll be back in an hour," you don't know anything. You don't know who's going to be back in an hour, and you don't know when it was written. It could have been written 10 years ago. It could have been written 5 minutes ago. You don't know when anybody's going to be back, okay? So a lot of our words function this way and don't have a referent. They don't have a fixed referent. Their referent is floating, and their referent is determined by the context of utterance. So that's sort of just a trivial example of how the reference theory of meaning is incorrect. And what ends up happening is people think, if I can't point to an object, then that word is meaningless, right? So it's funny, I was in a comment exchange earlier today. Someone was pointing out that you'll sometimes hear people say, unicorns are only concepts, right? And that's kind of a weird thing to say. Unicorns are concepts? No, a concept is a concept, right? The concept of a unicorn is a concept. A unicorn isn't a concept. A unicorn is an animal. It's just not real, okay? But people say, no, unicorns are concepts. No, a unicorn is an animal. It's just not a real animal. But people think, oh, if it's not a physical thing, then it's not real. And if it's not, okay, well, yes, unicorns aren't real. But then they think, well, then it's merely a concept. But a unicorn isn't merely a concept. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that sort of like a layman's use of the word concept? Because, I mean, it's like, it's a conceptualized animal that doesn't exist in that sense. But I mean, I know what you're saying, but
right. But see, the idea is this: the fact that something is a concept doesn't mean it isn't also an object, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a referent. I can have the concept of zebra. You know what? There are zebras. So zebras are actual in the world, physical things. They're physical objects, but there's also the concept of a zebra. Okay. But the fact that I have a concept of a zebra doesn't mean that zebras are just concepts. Right? But it's the same thing for a unicorn. Unicorns are not just concepts, right? Why? Because that's confusing what you're talking about. The concept of a zebra is the concept of an animal, but the concept of a zebra is a concept, right? But I mean, this gets extremely abstract. But people can confuse, concepts and objects all the time, and they think that whenever a word doesn't have a physical referent, they think that the concept is merely a concept and doesn't refer to an object. It refers to an object, it just turns out that it refers to an object that doesn't exist, right? They refer to non-existent objects. Consider the following. Like, some people will say, well, if something doesn't refer to an object in the world, then it's meaningless. Consider the following expression. The present king of France is bald. Is that meaningless? It's perfectly meaningful. There's a problem, though. There is no present king of France. So it doesn't refer to anybody. Is that sentence true or false? Well, it's certainly not true that the present king of France is bald, because there's no present king of France. But if you think it's false, it's not because it turns out that he's got hair. Right?
Well, it just so happens that I checked out Ancestry.com, and he's right here in the hangout with us.
Oh, right is now. It me?
Oh, sorry. No. It was actually George, but no.
So the expression "the present king of France" is meaningful, even though it refers to nothing. So something doesn't have to refer to anything to be meaningful. And people get this confusion all the time. They say if it doesn't refer to a physical thing, it's meaningless. No, that's stupid, right? We do this all the time. Every time you utter a falsehood, you're referring to something that isn't the case. Does it mean that every falsehood you've ever uttered is meaningless? No, it's not meaningless. It's perfectly meaningful, right? So if I say that the Earth orbits the moon, that describes a state of affairs that is non-actual. Does that mean that that sentence was meaningless? No, it's merely false, right? The only way a sentence can be true or false is if it's at least meaningful, right? But people sort of get their knickers in a twist because they have a naive theory of language where the meaning of a word is the referent, and the referent can only be a physical object. It can't be an abstract object. And then next thing you know, they're ruling things out of existence that everyone takes for granted as actually existing, and that they themselves actually act as if they think they exist. And then we end up sounding really stupid. We end up with a throttled ontology. We're sort of choking ourselves trying to narrowly define reality according to some silly physicalism and a narrow, village idiot kind of physicalism. And we should avoid that at all costs. It just makes us look ridiculous.
There should be more of this type of thing in primary education, not waiting until tertiary education for people to get some of their first glimpses of, these types of.
I agree with that. I mean, you have to seek it out, even in like college level.
Yeah, like have an elective or something.
Yeah, you have to have an
Critical
elective.
thinking, critical thinking as an elective in my university. An elective? Critical thinking? We should all be thinking critically. What's going on? Someone
That's
missed a
true.
trip. Why do we need a class for that? Now, so late in
Well,
life.
some of these things, like the reference theory of meaning, the naming theory of language, the difference between sense and reference, and stuff like that. And the examples that I gave, you can go to university, for years and years. You'll never study this unless you happen to take a course in linguistics or in the philosophy of language, right? But I agree with Mordred and with Helena. This is exactly the kind of thing that should be taught in primary school, because there's nothing conceptually difficult about this. This is very straightforward stuff, right? Words don't have to refer to physical objects to be meaningful, right? Words don't even have to refer to anything at all that exists to be meaningful. That's not how language works. Language does not consist of only names for things that actually exist. But most of us go through life thinking this, right? And that gets you into trouble. It results in you uttering stupidities, right? And an awful lot of what passes for philosophy is predicated on grotesque misunderstandings of language, hilarious howlers, but you can dispense so much bad philosophy, so much Oprah Winfrey, Deepak Chopra nonsense if we just taught this stuff in primary school, just basic stuff about the nature of language.
No, but you just have to think about the mind and the consciousness, and then you'll understand that I have no idea what he's talking about.
Don't forget to throw in some quantum dynamics.
That was a horrible Deepak Chopra imitation. Anyway, I will have to say that I do have to end the hangout because I need to sleep at some stage. It's required. And yeah, it's just coming on 2 hours. I don't mind if you guys want to arrange something else, but it would have to be through someone else, sort of externally. I guess it's a good time to sort of wrap things up. But thanks everyone for coming on and being a part of Supernatural Side Salad Show again. We'll be back next fortnight after Magic Sandwich Show this coming week. Is anyone here going to be on the Magic Sandwich Show this week?
I possibly will, yeah.
Yeah. Oh well. In any case, yeah. Thanks everyone, and I'll stop the broadcast now.
Thank you.